You'll take your seats. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Don Jennings. I'm the president of South Brevard Historical Society. Today we have Ben DiBiase, Director of Educational Resources for the Florida Historical Society. He's going to talk about Florida author Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings and the research she conducted for a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Yearling. The book was #1 on the bestseller list of 1938 for 23 consecutive weeks and remains a favorite for people today. One thing is Rawlings was an active member of the Florida Historical Society, and they have many of her artifacts there. So without further ado, please help me welcome Ben.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Good. Good afternoon. I apologize, I was running a little bit late. I gave Don a heart attack. I got here just in time. My name is Ben DiBiase. I've met a lot of you before. I've actually spoken here to the South Brevard Historical Society. I think this is my 4th time on various Florida history topics. I work as the archivist and director of educational resources for the Florida Historical Society, which is located just up in Cocoa, about 30 minutes north of here. We operate a research library, and believe it or not, we're actually the oldest cultural organization, continuously operating cultural organization in the state of Florida. The society was founded back in 1856. I always like to give a little rundown for anyone not familiar with the organization. Founded in 1856, disbanded during the American Civil War, reorganized in the early 20th century. We're headquartered in Jacksonville for a while. Started in St. Augustine, we're in Jacksonville. Later moved the headquarters to Gainesville within the Special Collections Department of the University of Florida. Later moved to the University of South Florida over in Tampa. And then in the late 20th century, then director Dr. Nick Wynn, some of you who've been around here for a while are probably familiar with Nick's work and have heard him speak before. But he met the Rossiter sisters, Caroline and Ella Rossiter. Some of you may be familiar with their home, which we manage today. It was part of an agreement between the Historical Society and the Rossiter sisters to help establish a house museum in Eau Gallie to preserve their family's history. And the Florida Historical Society serves as the managing organization. And that's the reason that the society is now here in Brevard County. We have a lot of people come in and ask us, what are we doing here, kind of off the beaten path? But it's because of that relationship in the 1990s that the society moved to Cocoa. They were able to purchase a 1939 WPA-era post office building, which we now utilize as our research library and headquarters. So if anyone's in Cocoa, we're open Tuesday through Saturday. We have a great bookstore. If you're interested in doing research, please stop in and just say hi. I'm happy to show people around. The collection is filled with tens of thousands of documentary materials related to our state's history. Some of the earliest materials we have date back to the 16th century, to the earliest Spanish period in Spanish occupation here in Florida's history. In fact, one of the oldest books that we have in our rare book collection is a first edition copy of La Florida del Inca, which is a narrative account of Hernando de Soto's 1539 expedition. It was published in 1605. And it was actually, the copy was originally owned by none other than Henry Flagler, the famous railroad magnate. He was also a member of the Florida Historical Society. So as I said, we're one of the oldest cultural organizations in the state. And because we've been around so long, and going back and looking at the history of historical societies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they were essentially a place where old things went to die, so to speak. It was a repository for anything old, relics, documents. If anyone was interested in history, they brought things to the quote-unquote Historical Society. And the FHS was no different. And because it was the only organization of its type in the state at that time, a lot of influential Floridians became members. I mentioned Henry Flagler. But another of our more prominent members was a woman by the name of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. Marjorie Rawlings joined the society, we believe, sometime in about 1936, based on some of the existing membership roles that we have. She was at one point an active director, believe it or not, in the society. She gave historic lectures like I'm doing right now. She spoke at our annual meeting. She did research in our research library when it was housed in St. Augustine, later in Jacksonville. She actually worked to judge high school history essays, a Florida history essay contest that was going on prior to World War II. So she volunteered her time and expertise, her literary expertise, and her historical knowledge quite a bit to the society. And because of this relationship, the society holds a lot of original correspondence between Marjorie, Kinnan, and Rawlings. But we also have some other interesting ephemera that I'll kind of get into throughout this talk. But there's kind of a long and interesting history between our organization and Rawlings and her work on Florida history. Now this is actually taken from one of our quarterlies. FHS publishes a journal called the Florida Historical Quarterly. Some of you are probably familiar. It's an academic peer-reviewed journal on Florida history. She published some small pieces. She didn't publish any full-length articles. But this is a page that lists the directors. And you'll see at the bottom here, I believe we have Marjorie, Kinnan, Rawlings. Yep, here we are at the top, listed as one of the directors. So she was heavily involved in the society's operations over the years. Now, another interesting person, another name that I want to mention is kind of part of this story, is a gentleman here, Watt Marchman. Now, Watt became the librarian of the society in the early 1930s, and he only left during World War II because he was drafted into the Army. But Marchman did more, I think, for the society to bring it into the 20th century and kind of take it from that antiquarian society to an active historical society that was involved in publication, that reached out to literary authors, fictional authors like Marjorie, Kinnan, Rawlings, to try and not only collect things that related to the state's history, but also disseminate that information. So he was instrumental in building up the research library, but then also keeping up with research correspondence. So a lot of the letters back and forth between Rawlings and the society are between specifically Watt Marchman and Marjorie, Kinnan, Rawlings. Talk a little bit about Marjorie Rawlings herself. She wasn't born in Florida. She's not a native Floridian, although if anyone's read her writing, you might think that she was. And she became intimately familiar with the rural Florida lifestyle, what we might affectionately call the cracker lifestyle in parts of rural areas of Florida that arguably still exist today, but especially in the early 20th century when huge segments of the society were living kind of off the grid, so to speak, but they weren't known by at least mainstream Americans. Most people knew very little about what was happening in Florida, who lived there, especially these small subsistence farmers. But Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings became interested in these groups very early on. She and her husband moved to Florida. They bought a small home in Hawthorne, which is in north central Florida, in the late 1920s, either 26 or 28. Unfortunately, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings took to the lifestyle quite quickly, but unfortunately her husband didn't. And according to many of her biographers, that led to the demise of her first marriage, because her husband did not like the rural Florida cracker lifestyle and much preferred living in a more metropolitan lifestyle. Now, Rawlings was originally from Washington, D.C. She was a college graduate. She began writing in the late teens and early 1920s, although didn't find commercial success until in the early 1930s when she published her first 2 novels. Prior to that period, she had a few small short stories published. She had been involved in teaching and done a few other things. But after becoming married, which was customary at that time, women did not usually have a kind of a long career in writing. And Rawlings didn't do much until she had moved to Florida. And some of you may be familiar. Well, first let me ask you, has anyone ever read The Yearling? Just by show of hands. So a few people, okay. So you're familiar with the book. This is probably arguably her most well-known work of fiction, probably her most well-known work, period, is The Yearling. It was originally published in 1938, but as I said, this wasn't her first novel. And it wasn't her first novel strictly on Florida either. She had published earlier books, one by the name of, entitled South Moon Under. Some of you may be familiar with that. It relates to what the backdrop is really moonshining in the interior of Florida. A lot of her early stories dealt more in the genre of what we would call today romance novels. Her characters, she built complicated webs. You know, her characters were oftentimes involved in very tumultuous relationships, whether that was familiar relationships, romantic relationships. And a lot of her early work reflects that. And the Yearling arguably does as well, although the Yearling kind of created its own subgenre, which we'll talk about later. But these early works were kind of firmly rooted in romantic, classical literary romanticism. And unfortunately, were not that commercially successful. Another book she wrote was called Golden Apples, which even she, in a letter that she wrote to the Society, termed as garbage. She didn't like the book. She said it was too romantic and got farther and farther away from what she wanted to write about, which was the life and times of the people that she was living in and around in Cross Creek, which is the home that she moved to in north central Florida, which is actually now part of, and unfortunately don't have a large map of the state, but I'll just show you part of it. Lake Kerr becomes integral in this story when I talk about the source material, but this is right in the center of what is now the Ocala National Forest. So if you're familiar with the state of Florida, the Ocala National Forest takes up a huge swath of north central Florida, in between Ocala, which at the time, Ocala was one of the largest towns at the time. Let me go back. Okay, so as I mentioned before, Marjorie Rawlings joined the Society shortly after moving to Florida. And when she moved to Florida, she dove in head first. Like I said, when she first moved to Cross Creek, at least according to a lot of her biographers and according to a lot of her letters, most of the local inhabitants kept her at arm's length. She was an outsider, she was educated, and she asked a lot of questions. So often she wasn't able, at least initially, to get the information that she really wanted. She was fascinated with how these people survived in the wilderness of Florida, how these small, what she would call poor farmers, subsistence farmers, how they grew their crops, how they survived, what were they doing, why did they want to live in this harsh environment. Especially at that time, this is prior to rural electrification efforts, brought on by the New Deal. A lot of these people still lived by candlelight in the 1930s, had very little contact with the outside world. Again, she mentions Ocala as being the big city. If you think about that today, Ocala is some may refer to as kind of still a rural kind of area, but that was the closest to civilization that most of these people had ever been in. She interviewed Civil War veterans and the children of Civil War veterans, people who still referred to it as the Great War. So their perception of life was very different than the rest of America, or at least the America that she came from. So she was fascinated with capturing these stories. And in doing so, she did a lot basically through interviews. In fact, most of her book is based on what we would now call folklore, oral history accounts. Even though the Yearling is categorized as fiction, it could be argued that it's historical fiction, meaning that everything in the story happened, just like another famous Florida novel, A Land Remembered, written by Patrick Smith. His son just presented here a couple weeks ago. But he would argue that Patrick Smith himself would say, even though the characters in the story were fabricated, every event in that book happened to someone, just not to one family. And that's the same case, with the Yearling and many of her other books. The stories occurred, she heard these stories firsthand from the residents living in and around Cross Creek in that part of north central Florida, but the characters that she created were fictionalized, thus it was categorized as fiction. Now this is an example, one scan of a letter, and I brought a few copies of some of the original letters as well, of her correspondence between the Florida Historical Society. Now this is 1939. This is after the Yearling had come out, and it's in response actually to a letter that Watt Marchman wrote to Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings praising the Yearling. He told her in this letter how wonderful it was. It's receiving great critical praise. A lot of Florida historians and folks within the Florida Historical Society were very impressed with the writing style, but also with her ability to capture that segment of Florida history and life in Florida, contemporary life in Florida at that time. And she's actually referencing Marchman's attempt to get her to speak at an annual meeting. And unfortunately, at this point, she was unable to. But you can see her, if you've ever seen Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' signed copy, she has a very distinctive signature and writing style. Now, this is that original letter that Watt Marchman wrote, congratulating her on the publication of her book, and also asking her a little bit about the farm journal that she used as a baseline for the work. Now, I mentioned the farm journal a little bit, and you'll hear quite a bit about the farm journal. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings in the early 1930s was on a fishing trip on a place called Lake Kerr. I showed you a map earlier of it, Kerr, which is now part of the Ocala National Forest. And according to her letters to her editor and some other friends at the time, explaining how she came across this particular farm journal, they went ashore looking for fresh water. They'd been on a fishing trip, they were there all day. She went ashore and found an old, how she described it as a dilapidated plantation home, which was at one point fairly sizable. But she said the roof was caved in, the windows were blown out, there was no front door. Clearly no one was living at this site. So she let herself in, walked around, poked around, found some old papers lying on a paper, made her way upstairs to this mansion. And sitting on a table was a bound journal. She opened it up, just kind of briefly looked at it. It looked like there were some journal entries. So she said, well, rather than letting this poor journal sit here and die in the elements, she scooped it up, put her back on the boat, and brought it home with her. And this farm journal, she pored over the next few years and became a primary source for the background information that she would use in conjunction with the oral history accounts that she gathered around Cross Creek to build the story of the Yearling. Now, I'll pause just briefly and talk a little bit about it for those who haven't read the book. The Yearling is, as the name suggests, it's about a deer. It's really about a family who is living in this part of Florida in the early 1870s. Now, they are what we would call subsistence farmers. The main character, the protagonist, a guy named Josie, a young man named Josie, Baxter. He has a mother and father. Now, his mother and father had several other children who had died within infancy, and Josie was the only one who survived into childhood. And when we pick up the story, Josie is living and working with his mother and father. As subsistence farmers, they are growing food essentially to survive, and they're selling the very small cash crops that they do produce. So they're making very little money, really just eking by. They're surviving in this frontier landscape. And the environment that Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings creates was based quite a bit on this original farm journal that dates from about 1853 up until 1872. A daily work log. It also includes a lot of colorful information about people and places and events that were occurring at that time period. And the Yearling, as it progresses through the book, I won't give the entire book away, but Josie befriends a deer. He takes in a small fawn as a pet. Hence the name the Yearling, and it's really a coming-of-age story. Now, the Yearling itself today is considered what we call young adult fiction. At the time, that subgenre, I guess, of fiction did not exist. Books today, like the Twilight series, which became hugely popular, were really built on the backs of this story. It's about the struggles that a young person endures going through this particular period in life. Struggles with friendships and family, learning the harsh realities of life. And nowhere was that more apparent than on the frontier landscape of north central Florida. So, part of the success, I would argue, of the Yearling is that it captures a particular time and place that most Americans, again, were not familiar with, but every American who had grown up was familiar with. They knew the common themes, the struggles that this main protagonist had gone through, but they were learning more about the wild frontier. So essentially it was the same story, just in a different place. And that's why it was so successful, and is today. In fact, the first time I read the book was actually in high school as part of a English composition class. So for many schools in Florida, this has become required reading. Her prose is very flowing. It's very easy to read, although she incorporates quite a bit of the vernacular, contemporary vernacular of the time. So there can be some stumbles here, but that gives you kind of an idea of why the book was so popular and what she was trying to create, or at least the imagery that she was trying to create at the time period. Now, let me go back to this letter. I want to make sure this is the right one. I may not have copied it, but Marchman also, back and forth in a number of his letters, he also requests first edition copies, signed copies of her books to be deposited in the FHS library, which she willingly obliged. In fact, this is the front cover of the Yearling, signed and inscribed by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And if you read through it, she actually gives a synopsis of the book. So you can imagine this is really a unique treasure. We haven't found this in any other book. It's a first edition, first printing. In fact, we have a first printing of every one of her novels published in the FHS library. But inside of the front cover of every book, she wrote a quick synopsis of the book and why it was important for Florida history research. And here she talks about the Yearling laid out 1870, 1871 for the express purpose of using the flood around 1971. Now the flood becomes a big a part of the story. Again, I won't give away too much, but there is a massive flood that it helps to illustrate the again the hardships of the environment of North Central Florida at that time period. She says the characters are fictional, one exception, but the topography is literal with true place names. Now that's also very important too, and why it's I think lingered or becomes so important in Florida history, in the realm of Florida history, because she describes these place names accurately. And again, a lot of that is based on the Farm Journal. Because remember, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings was living in Cross Creek almost a century after, well, less than that, probably 60, 70 years after the story would have taken place. So the times certainly did change, but not that much. So with the combination of her oral history accounts and this original Farm Journal really came together and culminated into a very unique and I would argue accurate look at what life was like on the ground based on these primary source materials. Now let me talk specifically about the book itself. So Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings found this house. She's gone upstairs, she's taken the Farm Journal. She didn't remember exactly when. According to a letter she wrote to Perkins, her editor, she found it sometime in 1934, maybe 35. The book was published in 1938. So she had this Farm Journal in her possession for at least a few years. And we know that, again, she utilized quite a bit of the information, the price of goods. She talks a little bit about some of the characters that are found in the Williamson Journal appear in the Yearling. But who actually wrote this book? So we know that the Farm Journal was created by someone. And that took a little bit of research, and that's kind of an interesting section of this story. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings decided to donate the Farm Journal to the Florida Historical Society. It took a little bit of convincing. Once Marchman found out that she had this journal, he convinced her that the best place for it would be within the research library, within the archive, where it's still housed today. So Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings did oblige. She sent it to the society. But we didn't know much about it. So Marchman set out to try and piece together where this journal came from. We needed that provenience. We needed to know where it came from. Otherwise, it wasn't that terribly important, at least for serious scholarship. And it turns out, based on census information and based on information entered into the Farm Journal, that it was written by a man named Thomas Williamson. And Williamson, excuse me, was originally born in South Carolina in 1817, married Catherine Schuler in 1831. Now they did have 10 children, and just like the Yearling, the majority of the children they had, I can't remember, I believe they had 3 that survived into adulthood. So between 6 or 7 did not survive either infancy or childhood, which was not uncommon at that time. There were very high infant mortality rates, especially in the South, during and after the American Civil War. So he had 10 children. They moved to Florida sometime before the war. We know that Williamson and 2 of his sons served in the Confederacy. We found some of their muster rolls. One fought with the 2nd Florida Infantry. The father was part of a home guard, so he never left Central Florida, but one of his other sons was killed while fighting with the 2nd Florida I believe in while fighting with Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. I can't remember the exact battle, but one son didn't come home. So again, the family, just like the Baxter family, had gone through some serious tragedies in their life. Not only the death of their infant children, but then the death of children after the war. It's part of the story too. The old man Baxter was a Civil War veteran, so that part of that plays into the story as well. So they came to Central Florida, settled not very far from where Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings was living in Cross Creek on a place called Lake Kerr. They built the Williamson homestead in what was then Marion County, still is Marion County, but is now part of the Ocala National Forest. And Williamson, we know, died in 1879. Again, this is a early 20th century survey that shows Lake Kerr, and the Williamson homestead is actually right here on the lake. So that's where Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings landed in the 1930s, found the journal, and this is where a lot of that material came from. So their farm and homestead would have been right here on the north side of that lake. Now this is a copy of a homestead grant that Catherine Williamson received after her father had died. So she actually inherited the property and applied for a further homestead. So she actually acquired more property. We don't know how long or how many of her family members stayed on the farm. Again, we know that one son did not come back from the war, but we did have one son who was a veteran of the Civil War, did come back, and we believe probably married, lived in and around Marion County, but we're not exactly sure. Now this is the actual book. So this is a scan from the Williamson Farm Journal, dated 1858. So you can kind of get an idea of how much information is locked inside of these. Walk over here. What I've actually brought with me, I didn't bring the original journal. I couldn't bring that outside of the archive, but I did bring a transcript. So, and after the talk, I encourage you please come up and take a look at this, because there's really some fascinating information about Florida in the 19th century. This transcript was done by Watt Marchman at the request of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, because part of the agreement to donate the original journal to the Society's archives was that the Society would produce a typewritten transcript. And that's what we're looking at today. Marchman spent about a year creating this transcript. And it is, I compared it to the original, it is about as accurate as you can get. And would have been absolutely painstaking to actually produce it. So here's kind of an example. So it looks, the margins are exactly the same, the dates are the same. If a page is torn off, it's indicated here. So all the information that Marchman collected is very accurate and true to the original farm journal. I want to read just a quick passage, just give you an idea of what type of material is being written. So here Williamson, this is part of his daily workbook, dated March 6th of 1857. Most of the sentences are incomplete. They're spelled phonetically, so gives an indication of probably his education level. But he says here, March 6th, commenced planting corn and planted all day. Caldwell, Graham, and myself went deer hunting. Frank killed a fine deer. Quite a cold day in the evening, clouded up at night, set to rain, and rained all night. And the same day, let J.T. Hull have $1 worth of sugar, 1 bushel of potatoes, slips at 37.5 cents per bushel. March 11th, finished planting 15 acres of corn on the same day. Commenced bedding cottonland. Weather continues odd with occasional heavy rains. Helped roll logs. So kind of gives you an idea of day-to-day what they're going through. But there's a great passage of a wedding. They talk about some part of the community life. He mentions when so-and-so was married, if someone died and they attended a local funeral. You'll notice too throughout this day-to-day there's a lot of communal assistance. He mentions helping out TJ or so-and-so do this and that. Also mentions someone coming on his farm, whenever needed. So there's a sense of, and we see this too in the Yearling, when Rawlings talks about the community and the strength of these small rural communities to assist one another in basic survival. Because when it really comes down to it, that's what these groups were trying to do, was just trying to eke out a basic living from the land on which they were living. And we get a lot of that from the Farm Journal. This is another passage from a little bit later. You can see some of the handwriting changes a little bit. Again, Williamson actually kept this journal up until about a year before he passed away, and then the journal abruptly ends. And there are huge years that are missing. In fact, during the American Civil War, we have no entries. He doesn't pick back up until about 1867. So we don't know if he didn't make it back. It's very likely he could have been held as a prisoner of war and wasn't exchanged, didn't make it back to Florida until that time period, or maybe his sons didn't make it back and they weren't farming. So there are still a lot of question marks. We don't know. But what we do know is that it helped to build the fabric of this story that so many hold dear today. Now this is another letter, and actually I brought a copy of the letter here today, that Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings wrote to Washington, and this is in 1937. This is actually prior to the publication of the book, and they had been corresponding a little bit about the research because Rawlings had spent some time in the archive conducting research, trying to build together a cohesive narrative. She says here, quote, "I have an old account book and day book on a farm in the scrub section near either the St. Johns or the Ocklawaha River. I have not definitely decided which. It covers, with gaps of some years, the years between 1853 and 1872. There is considerable human interest in it. Sometime this year, would you like to have me work up a manuscript of the highlights of it for the quarterly?" She never did that. Instead, Watchman again convinced her to donate the actual journal. And the only reference that we actually have in the quarterly of this journal shows up some years later. I'm sorry, I don't have a scan of it. And it just mentions that it was donated by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And all it says is, Old Farm Journal, donated by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. So we really don't understand the gravity or the importance, rather, of this farm journal until many years later. I'll keep it a little bit. Now, the plot thickens, okay? After Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings had donated the book to the journal, the Yearling has been published at this point. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1939. It's in the open. The stories are out there. There's one person in particular who happened to read the Yearling and recognized some of the stories, recognized some of the names, and actually inquired with the Florida Historical Society about Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, because he knew that she had been involved with the society and had done quite a bit of historical research leading up to the publication. This gentleman was V.L. Hastings, related to the Hastings family up in Flagler County, but also the grandson of Thomas Williamson. V.L. Hastings had no idea that his grandfather had kept this farm journal. There's a series of correspondence between the society and Mr. Hastings about the actual farm journal. And he at one point writes a rather interesting letter that I have up here, dated April 11th, 1941. I'll just read a quick passage. What he's asking and inquiring about it. He says, quote, "It would be of interest, however, in knowing how the organization came to be in possession of this book of my grandfather's. I am glad that some thoughtful person has turned it over to the proper guardians, but have a natural curiosity to know by what devious route it arrived there. It was never in my possession, and I did not know that such a book existed until Mrs. Ott allowed a friend of mine to see and read it." And he also goes on to talk about reading the Yearling, enjoying the book, but you can tell there's a little bit of anger, curious about what happened and how, what exactly happened to the family's history. We know that after Mrs. Williamson had died, the property fell into disrepair, and the sons, for whatever reason, whoever was surviving, did not inherit the property, but it explains why the property was in such disrepair in 1934 or 5 when Rawlings arrived. Now, was she trespassing on the property, and did she steal something that was, rightfully someone else's? That's for history to decide, because it's difficult to say. Because in taking this journal, she created one of the best, at least in terms of Florida's history, one of the best novels containing Florida history elements ever produced. It's up there with other books on the subject. So, it's a little bit difficult. Now, there is a little bit more correspondence. Hastings was satisfied when he received a copy of the transcript, not the original. He was very happy that the Society provided that for him, read through the book, and provided copies to many of his relatives. So, and in doing so, Hastings also provided a lot of genealogical information to fill in those gaps. So Marchman could then build up the provenience of the original farm journal, house it within the collections. But ironically enough, all of his research was done. The journal was donated to the society. All of Rawlings' books were in the society's headquarters. Rawlings didn't publish much after it was in 1945. There was a libel suit brought against her from one of the residents of Cross Creek, whose name was actually used in a book that Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' book wrote called Cross Creek, which goes into detail about some of the characters that existed in the Pinelands at that time period. And she didn't take kindly to her characterization. It was a long and kind of arduous suit. Rawlings did end up, was at fault, but she was only ordered to pay, I believe, $1 in damages. The judge didn't see much beyond what the libel was bringing to the court. But after that, she published very little. She remarried again. She moved to St. Augustine, spent much of her time in St. Augustine, and wrote very little, at least based on Florida. She published one of the novel, was never as successful as The Yearling. And when she passed away, her books were certainly still popular, but not as popular as The Yearling ever was. And the Farm Journal, for all of its importance and its role in the shaping and developing of this book, it was buried away in the Society archives. And it actually wasn't found until 2013 by me, believe it or not. It was part of a miscellaneous manuscript collection. We were rearranging and recataloging some of our, and rehousing a lot of the old material that had come to Brevard County from University of South Florida. And in one of these, I believe it was a correspondence record and one of our old catalog records that said, Thomas, this Farm Journal. So I said, well, let me take a look at it. Then we started finding all the correspondence records related to the Provenience and how it came to the society. And we were actually approached by the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society, which still exists today, and they work to preserve a lot of Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' works. They publish critical literary essays about Rawlings. In 2013, at the University of Florida, they were hosting a 75th anniversary of the publishing of the Yearling. And they asked us to present some information about the journal. And that's why I put together this talk, and we've kind of rediscovered the journal. And I'm actually working now on providing, or at least putting some of this into print to be published into the Florida Historical Quarterly, because it is a fascinating story. And there's a lot more correspondence. Rawlings was a very colorful person. She loved Florida. She particularly loved, as I've said before, the people who existed in this time and place, kind of away from insulated rather from the outside world. You know, so many had, like I said, never left their farms. They lived and died on these properties, and in doing so developed their own culture. They developed strong kinship and community ties, and she wanted to highlight that through her writings, which is, I would argue, probably one of the most important aspects of The Yearling and her other books. So her relationship with FHS was certainly important because it was preserved today for historians and literary historians to understand better that lifestyle, that time and place. But it's also important for us now because it brings to life this wonderful story that so many of us thought, at least I did, was it had to be fiction. There's no way that any of this occurred, but now we know that it did. It did. People lived these lives. They had that close relationship with the land, and just like we do today, young people of a certain age went through a lot of the same issues coming of age that they did, over a century ago. So, with that, I think I'll kind of wrap it up, and I'll open it up for questions if anyone has any. Yes.
I guess, Ben, just comment to begin with. You said it was young adult fiction these days, and I can't quite imagine that. I suppose a really advanced senior high school class, perhaps, or any students who are made to read it.
Right.
But I don't think they pick it up on their own. It's just a comment.
Sure.
It
is. Well, there are.
It's an adult.
It is. And I think that label. And now this is a label, and this is actually going on the Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings Society. They classify it as young adult fiction. And I actually read the book, I believe as a freshman in high school. It was required reading as part of an English composition class. Now I can tell you, as a freshman in high school, a lot of it went right over my head. Now rereading it as an adult, you can pick up quite a bit more. about the story, and you do start to learn quite a bit more about that would be considered more, standard fiction, not just young adult fiction. And I think the classification again just comes from the protagonist and his coming of age kind of story. Here you have a young boy dealing with death, dealing with issues with family, fights with neighbors, and then resolution and all of that. The types of things that a teenager, I guess today you could argue, would have to deal with and learn from. At that time.
I was just thinking, it's over 400 pages, and I can't imagine.
Yeah, and actually,
voluntarily doing that when I was.
The student version, I think, omits certain language too. Just like the Elena Remembered, there's a student volume that's produced with Elena Remembered that's broken into 2 pieces, and they take out certain words, that they deem, if not, really applicable, at least for young people. It doesn't really do much for the story for young people.
Just one other question. In the journal, you speak of him going out to planting the corn and then the cotton and so forth, but you don't mention slaves.
Well, and when I guess I didn't talk much about that. When I mentioned
You go to the plantation.
That's it, and I call it a subsistence plantation, meaning that, and in terms of, for agricultural historians, when they talk about subsistence farming, that generally means someone who's producing their own crops for survival. So very few of those crops are being used or being sold, I guess, so to speak. The Williamsons, didn't have any slaves. There's no indication, at least, of that. In the Yearling, this is after the Civil War. But because they moved down here in the 1850s, and again, just based on their journals, they don't, and expenses, things like that, they don't mention anything about slaves. And that was not
suggested you used the term plantation.
Plantation, and that might be a misnomer.
Plantation,
Yeah, that shouldn't.
Plantation has come to mean one thing, but originally it was a place where you had plants.
Yeah.
Right. A homestead where you were principally growing, a crop of some kind for survival. But yeah, I guess there could be. And I can change. I don't want to say semantics, but yeah, you're right. Maybe the word means something different a little bit now. We envision the grand white, plantation with a wraparound porch and the planter elite who never got their hands dirty. That was not the experience of the Williamsons. Yeah.
Does anybody know where the Williamson homestead actually is in today's location?
What's left of it, yeah. It's part of, and that Kerr City, and I don't know if I remember pronouncing it right, I called it Kerr, I've heard it called Kerr City. It was bought up in the late 20th century. What's left of it is considered a ghost town. There was a central town there that's on the north side of the lake. There's one little 2-lane highway that will take you out there if you're driving through the National Forest. It's very far off the beaten path. And the surviving homesteads, the Williamson house has long since been destroyed. It was either, like I said, when Rawlings found it, it was fairly dilapidated based on the description. So it probably just came down. Over the years, it was used for wood or someone just came and took it out. But there are some surviving homes that date from that period, and they make up what they call Kerr City. And it's one of the quote-unquote Florida ghost towns that still exists today. But in the late 20th century, there was kind of an eccentric guy who bought up the property and now owns all of those homes and markets it as the Florida ghost town. So you can travel out there now. I think they just guided tours. I can't remember the gentleman's name now, but he's given some interviews for newspapers in Marion County, and every once in a while groups will go out there and you can see kind of what this ghost town, this town that was forgotten, still exists today. But a lot of that has to do with just declining prices in crops. There was overdevelopment, and people just moved on. Citrus was being grown there. There was a series of big freezes that took out a lot of plantations, and which was not uncommon in Florida. A lot of these small towns just disappeared. People moved on, left that infrastructure. But in Kerr City, a lot of it still exists today. So if you're ever up that way, you have to look for Lake Kerr. It's kind of shaped like it's got a kidney shape to it. It's a small lake. There is access. There are a few private homes still on the lake. There's the ghost town known as Kerr City on the northeastern part of the lake. But you can people still fish and hunt around that because it's part of the national forest. Yes.
The map you showed that had those lots, the county lot markings.
Right.
They had a G on them. Each one has a G. Now, if you
Right.
look above the west central north, it says Williamson right there on that,
Right.
and then you'll notice that 1, 2, 3, 4 lots have no G markers, so that may be the homestead itself.
Very possible, yeah, on that north part.
I'm imagining the G marking might indicate when the government was buying up the land for the purpose of making that into a...
And they were government lots, yeah. Now, this actual map predates that by quite a bit. So the Ocala National Forest didn't come into existence until 20th century. This is an 1885 map. So it would have predated that quite a bit. In fact, if you look over here, there's a segment of the Hernandez grant. This dates back to the second Spanish period. This was one of those big Spanish land grants that the heirs of Joseph Hernandez would have petitioned the U.S. government for and at least acquired. That's why all of the, if you ever notice this on a Florida map, all of these sections are going to be kind of cattywampus and they're off kilter because they were surveyed during the Spanish period long before the federal government began any kind of systematic township and range survey system, which didn't occur until the Seminole Wars period, when in fact most of the peninsula south of Gainesville wasn't even surveyed until after that time period. But that's a good question. I'd have to ask a survey. I don't know what the G stands for. But yeah, you can see that it is sectioned off and that it is partitioned. And if we look at if we probably read this legal description, we can probably match it up to the actual area. I haven't illustrated that on the map, but it would be. I'd be curious. I'd be interested to see where the original one was. Mm-hmm.
I've been on, there's a road that goes between Fort McCoy on the west and Salt Springs on the east that runs along the north edge of Lake Kerr, which is quite populated now. There must be several thousand people living up there. But there's a sign that says Kerr City. I've been by it a few months ago, and now it's gated off. You can't just drive down there and wander around and steal people's stuff down there.
Well, it's privately owned. So
but there was a video on TV that somebody did where that gentleman who owns it now gave a tour of it.
Okay.
So I don't know where that is or who did it. One of the local TV stations, like out of Gainesville or something, PBS. It was quite interesting, and I believe now he does like you say, he does tour people down there, and I believe he allows people to stay overnight. He has kind of a little bed and breakfast kind of a thing, but it's very closed place.
We can commodify it or anything, I guess. Yeah. We'll go with you.
Is this Farm Journal, excuse me, the transcript going, has that been published for purchase or is it going to be?
It hasn't. In fact, that's what I'm working on now for the quarterly because nobody's taken it up, and I contacted the Rawlings Society, and they had a few people that said, yeah, that'd be great. Somebody should do that. You know, it's one of those things where, yeah, that'd be great. Somebody should do it. So I've been working. It's one of those a dozen other projects I've worked on. Because we have a transcription, it makes it a little bit easier, and you know, we have to do a little bit more genealogical research to kind of fill out the Williamson story, but tying in, you know, with Rawlings. It's a great story, and like I said, because it's attached to such a famous novel, and because she came by it essentially by theft, you know, it's a kind of a wonderful story. But so we only have one copy of the transcriptions that Watt Marchman did, and this copy was Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings' original copy. So she commissioned Marchman to originally produce this copy. He gave her this, and this is the one that she then later gave back to the society in the 1940s. So this and the original journal are all we have, and it's the only one that I know still exists. Now, the Hastings family, when Mr. Hastings asked for and requested a transcript, that might still be out there somewhere, but we haven't been able to track that one down. But from what I've been able to find, it's very, very close to the original. So, and when you have a transcript, it makes it that much more easier to glean more information and produce a transcription. The University of Florida houses the majority of Rawlings' original manuscripts. We have parts of manuscripts, we have correspondence records, but actually the University of Florida has a Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings collection as part of their literary archives. Within that, they actually now have a copy of it. So we provided a copy of the transcripts for the University of Florida. So it's open for researchers to access. I don't think you have digitized it yet. Of course, we have the copy of the society. But yeah, the goal is to try and disseminate that information because for agricultural historians, this is rich primary source material. You know, there were probably thousands of farmers who kept some sort of farm journal, but how many of those survived? It's very minimal. In fact, the only reason it did survive was because Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings stole it. So
Yeah, because you figure once they've had it, and their heirs like, well, I don't need this, and
Right,
into the fire,
exactly.
so.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And having worked in the archives, I can't tell you how many times I hear about stories of these family papers that someone decides is not important, makes its way to the landfill every single day. So I always tell people, take another look at are there any materials that you might have that relates to your family history, to farming, to you don't know why it'll be important or if it is important. It's always worth inquiring with local historical societies. Sometimes counties want that material, state historical societies and university special collections. You never know. Because 50 years, from now, or 60, 70 years from now, somebody will write a Pulitzer Prize winning book based on that. So we just never know. Yeah.
Could you go back to the listing of the events in his life? Because I don't understand. If he was born in 1817 and he got married in 1831, he's 14 years old when he got married?
Probably not. I think you're right. I think there's something wrong there. I may have that date wrong. It may be 41. I may have
Yeah,
changed
because
that.
he moved to Central Florida in the early 50s, so it sounds
It's
like
probably
maybe
41. Yeah,
Okay.
that would be my guess. So.
Although you never know. He might have.
His wife could have been 14. That was not uncommon, but he was probably older, so it's probably 41. So probably would have been in his 20s, even when he got married.
Well, he would have been, if that was a 40, he would have been 24 instead of 14.
Exactly, yeah, which would make much more sense than getting married
I
at.
was just kind of.
In South Carolina, you know. Native Floridian, I can say that.
For girls, 14.
Right, exactly.
But not for the males.
Yeah, especially at that time, yeah, it's probably not common. Okay, this was that scan I was looking for. So this is the only entry in the Florida Historical Quarterly when they list new acquisitions by the library. Here at the bottom, it just says Florida Plantation Record Book, inscribed Thomas L. Williamson's book, presented by Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings. And that was it. So that was the only reference that existed. That's the only reference that's ever been published in the society. And this is in the 1930s, volume 16 would have been probably 1939, 1940. That was published. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have two questions. First, in Rawlings' inscription in that book, she mentions that one character, she used the real name. And I was
Right.
wondering who that was and why she did that. And
I'm not sure. I'd asked the Rawlings Society, and somebody was supposed to get back to me because I said I'd like to know who she actually used in the book. I'm not sure. If that was, it may have been the friend. I can't remember his name now. Josie's friend throughout the book, I think may have been a real name, but I'll have to look into it. Yes, yeah.
And the other comment you had mentioned, Perkins, was that Max Perkins?
Yes, Max Perkins, who was Hemingway's editor and worked with Fitzgerald, yeah. And he published and edited all of Rawlings' books. So her first two volumes, she had worked with Max Perkins on South Moon Under and Golden Apples. And there's a letter, there's actually a great volume of their correspondence that's been published, I don't think by the University Press of Florida, but it's available, and it's still in print. And it's a huge, huge volume of all of their correspondence back and forth. And in one of these letters in the 1930s, he is pushing her to, quote, write what you know. So here she is living in Florida. He says, enough of this stuff, the romance and literature. He said, just write what you know. Write what you see around you. Because she had actually sent him a few short stories about Cracker Life and some of these characters, and he said, this is great. Write a book about this. And that's where the Yearling came out of. So I don't know if that was after she found the journal or before. I'm still not really sure. And actually, the only story of how she acquired that journal is based on a letter that she wrote to Max Perkins about where the journal came from. So whether or not that's how she actually acquired it, I don't know. Because did she buy it off of a family member? I don't know. And want not disclose the names. It's very possible. So there's still some question around how she actually acquired the volume originally. And again, the legalities around how she got it to, I think, are interesting. So, yeah.
Having talked about her going on the lake, and I'm reading River Lakes,
Yes.
and about her trip down or up to St. John's. How much of that kind of thing did she do? How much?
Quite a bit.
in the water.
She spent a lot of time outdoors, and that's in a lot of her correspondence records, some of which was the society, a lot of which she has in the UF manuscripts library. She fished all the time. She went on hunting expeditions, and a lot of that was just kind of getting to know the local population. She would spend weeks. When she wrote South Moon Under, she lived for 3 weeks with a moonshiner in the woods of Marion County. If you can imagine that in the early 1930s, she was a married woman at that time, living in the woods with a moonshiner, and just taking notes and writing down the process. In fact, when you read South Moon Under, which is one of my favorite books, apparently she didn't like it that much, but it's really, really interesting. It's kind of another interesting story about a young man who's trying to save his family. In doing so, he has to raise the money through moonshine, through selling, illegal liquors in the 1920s. But it's really an interesting journey, and when you read through the process, it's clear that she understood how this liquor was distilled from corn, because she sat there at a still and wrote down everything that this still tender was doing. So she spent a lot of time outdoors. There are numerous photos of her fishing, and there's a famous photograph, I didn't include it here, that was later made into a stand of her standing, kind of with one weight on one leg, and she's holding a shotgun, going duck hunting or something like that. It was not uncommon. She did that a lot. She was absolutely a part of that Central Florida environment at that time, which was which meant that you had a close relationship with the outdoors.
Was her she came from around D.C. you
Right,
said.
right.
But her husband was originally from where? New York?
No, they met at, I believe she went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison is where she graduated from. And I believe they met there. But he was from New York. They met in college. I think they lived in Kentucky for a while. He was involved as a newspaper editor or something like
Was
that.
her family outdoorsy, or did they live down?
And that's a great question. I don't know. Early on, I don't know. From what I can tell, it's probably classical education.
And I think, a lot of times too, if you're not brought up in this kind of culture, I know my grandmother, who was, because my grandfather had a job with the railroad and he had to go away, and they had a farm. I mean, she and my mother, they could hunt, they could song, they could plant. I mean, they did everything, and it was just in that kind of culture. You're expected to do that, and if Marjorie Rawlings had a love of outdoors or whatever, she's going to fall right into this, because that's going to be, part of the whole community.
Exactly, yeah. So in order to become part of, or at least be accepted in the community, you have to be part of that.
Right.
And like you're saying, part of that is, women at that time doing that kind of work. Fishing, hunting, would be classically referred to as men's, activities. It was not, day-to-day life was not this romantic idea of, as you mentioned before, the plantation life. It was, from everything we've read, it was very hard living.
In fact, I remember reading in a book once about these women who had gone out, or man and his wife had gone out to sodbust in the 1800s, and the guy was writing back home to his brother, and it said basically, when you're looking for a wife, you don't want these weak, anemic women of the East. You want a woman who's sturdy and, it's really a whole different
And you
perspective.
see that when you read the Yearling and you talk about Ma, Josep's mother.
She's nothing like the movie.
No, yeah. I didn't mention that too. Some of you have probably seen it. Gregory Peck played, Old Dan Baxter. It became actually, I think both he and the actress who played Jane Wyman were both nominated for Oscars, and it was a very famous, movie, and it, for the most part, keeps, with the book. But yeah, the character of the
Pa and Ma are nothing like those.
They were a little bit tougher in the book, and in reality, I think closer.
Visually.
Right.
Yeah.
You have Hollywood actors who were playing these, dirty, poor farmers in Florida. Yeah. But I have to say that they did a really good job. They filmed that movie on location. It was filmed in Marion County. They actually rebuilt this cabin to look at it. Yeah. Oh, it's incredible. It's incredible because it was all filmed on location. In fact, the production almost halted because it went so far over budget. The production company didn't want to fund all of this stuff, but the director at the time, I can't remember his name,
wanted it to be as realistic as possible, and in doing so created a great film. That is, like I said, close to the story, and I think captured a lot of the sentiment of the story, of what Rawlings was trying to get across, which again I think was rooted in that coming of age kind of story. She was following her protagonist through a lot of ups and downs that came about from different environmental issues, things that existed around, Josie. So it's still a wonderful story. Every few years I like to pick it up and read it here and there. It's one of my favorite stories. Not just because I love Florence.
It's right into the
Yeah, but it's a wonderful book, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to pick up a copy. It's still in print today, and it's still very popular. So, well, very good. I think that's about my time. Thank you so much for your time.